Welcome, everyone, to the CG podcast, where we explore the legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic on science, society, and public health policy. I'm delighted to have our guest here today, Eric Winsberg, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of South Florida, and he's currently based at the Department of History and Philosophy at Cambridge University as a British Academy Global Professor. He's the author, along with Stephanie Harvard, of a recent book called Models in Science and Decision Making, which is an overview of the philosophical literature on models, mathematical models in the physical and natural sciences, and also biomedical sciences. And in the book, they draw a lot in terms of examples from climate change and also COVID-19. So it's great to have you on the podcast, Eric.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So give us just an overview of this book. It's a Cambridge Elements book, so it's a particular kind of audience and style. Can you just give us?
Yes. Okay. So it's Cambridge Elements is it's a new series that they have. It's a bit like the Oxford Short Introductions, I guess. So it's not quite a book. It's I think about 25,000 words. And it's they originally was actually Jacob Stegenga, who you had on a couple weeks ago, as the series editor for Philosophy of Science. And sort of right at the beginning of the pandemic, he emailed me and asked me if I would do the entry on models. And I said, boy, like there's a lot of stuff already on, introductions to models. And I think he knew already I'd really gotten wrapped up in some of the COVID modeling at the time. This was maybe December 2020 when he first contacted me. And I said, could I change it a little bit and not just have yet another entry on models, but have this be specifically about models that guide policy? Because I was pretty well known for my work on models of climate change, which are obviously policy relevant, and I'd gotten really interested in some of the COVID modeling. So that was kind of that. And then I brought Stephanie on board because we had been doing some work together on modeling and on what we call representational risk. So anyway, the book kind of walks you through what scientific models are, and then we get right into examples from climate science and from COVID modeling to kind of talk about questions like what are the purposes of models, and when do we have reasons for thinking that they're adequate for those purposes? I think that's kind of one of the central questions of the book, is when do we think models are adequate for the purposes that we put them to, and what some of the sort of what we call moral and sort of the overlap of moral and epistemic issues that arise when you're making models for guiding policy. So we kind of talk a little bit about how you assess adequacy for purpose and how that's kind of value laden in various ways.
Interesting. Okay. So coming from the world of climate models and then experiencing the pandemic, did you see some of the similar issues from climate science in your work before? Or were there sort of unique things from the infectious disease epidemiological world to you, and sort of how did you balance that?
First reaction, one of the things that originally got me interested in it was I found very early on people were drawing the analogy, and they were drawing it in the sort of very partisan culture war-y kind of way, and they were saying like, oh, the people who are sort of skeptical of these non-pharmaceutical intervention models, these are the same people that think that climate change is a hoax.
Right.
And I sort of thought, wait a minute, that doesn't seem quite right to me. Climate science and climate modeling has been going on since the 70s or 80s at least. It's based in a lot of pretty sound physical science. A lot of the models that we were seeing trotted out in March and April of 2020 were sort of just very quickly retooled models of flu epidemics that weren't really based in a lot of sound theoretical understanding. I didn't think hadn't really been validated much. We're using a lot of very guessed parameter values, and I thought, I really kind of want to get in front of this, because my initial worry was, wow, like when people see kind of how bad, because they're going to see, I knew people would see rather quickly that these models weren't doing very well, because I didn't think they would do well, and they didn't do very well. And I was originally worried, wow, when people see this, they're going to think we just got told this is exactly like climate science is, our climate model is this bad. So that was kind of that was my initial thing that got me sucked into it. So I thought originally I saw a lot of differences. I saw a lot of differences in terms of, what the kind of, the soundness of the theoretical background to the models was. And also just, another really big difference was, it seemed to me that, so both climate models and the pandemic models were models for evaluating policy choices in some respects, but typically, like in climate modeling, we don't evaluate. Climate models aren't. You don't put as input like a carbon tax or a rebate on cars or whatever. You put in a global carbon concentration pathway, and you don't think what different political policies are going to lead to a carbon pathway. That's complicated political science and energy science and all, so whereas the COVID models, right, like the ICL model, Neil Ferguson's model, we're really trying to just get right from soup to nuts, just like, okay, if we institute these following, executive orders, close schools, require that people who have various non-essential jobs be required to stay home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then we're going to get this result. Rather than, if there's X amount of, say, contact rate out in the population, we'll get this result. It was really just this, I thought, a certain amount of hubris and thing, and they could really just take like a policy decision that politicians would make and say, this is how many deaths you're going to get from that, which is something I think climate science tries to do.
Okay, interesting. So there's almost like an overabundance of certainty in terms of the intervention pathways and how that would impact the disease.
Yeah, it seemed that way to me at the time, and it feels like that turned out to be right. Yeah.
Right. Interesting. Okay. So, I mean, in the book, you talk about this difference between what you call model adequacy for purpose, right? Yeah. And then you talk about models for public decision making, right? And you actually differentiate quite strongly between those. Can you just give us a sense of what that difference is?
I wouldn't have thought of those as things that I distinguish. I think that models for public decision making, are typically models that we evaluate as being adequate for purpose or not, as opposed to when we typically think of like policy guiding models, we don't think of them as being true or not, right? We don't worry about the fact necessarily that in a climate model, clouds might be depicted in a slightly unrealistic way. We worry about whether that unrealistic way of depicting clouds is good enough for particular purposes. And we're typically cognizant of the fact that it might be good enough for, say, getting long-range global trends right, but not good enough for telling you, what your summer is going to be like on the Mediterranean coast in a year or something like that, right? So we tend to think of models like that as being tailored to a particular purpose, and then being kind of evaluated for their quality for that. And sometimes they can be good for one thing and not good for another thing. I think
it sounds like there's a lot more fuzziness to them then.
Yeah, that seems right. And that's sometimes I think people make mistakes with that. They take a model that's sort of, good for one purpose, and then they assume that since it's good for that purpose, it might be good for every purpose. So you might think that some of them, some certain basic epidemiological models, for example, this is something I think we say in the book, right? You might think models like that are kind of good for understanding, why epidemics come in waves. They might be good for understanding why in certain diseases, having enough percentage of the population inoculated with a vaccine can stop the spread of that. But then if you take a model like that and you just fill it out with lots and lots of details, you might imagine, well, then it can tell you what will happen if I close schools, if I, or even if I order schools closed or whatever. And just think that because it was sort of good for one purpose, that it's necessarily good for all these other, sometimes much more fine-grained and taxing purposes.
So there's lots of different types of modeling, different types of methods. Are there any particular types or methodologies that you really, I guess, take aim at or critique more than others?
In terms of pandemic modeling?
Yeah.
I mean, so I think almost all of the models are basically they're what they call individual based models, but they're really very elaborate compartment models, right? So like the ICL model just has you have these different kinds of people. You have young people, students, you have people in different kinds of jobs, and they kind of move through the world going to different spaces. Like they can go to school or they can go be in the home or whatever. And then you can have you can have different contact rates when they're in different places. And then the contact rate sort of tells you, based on how many people are infected, what the probability of people in that same compartment as them is of them, getting the virus. There were I think pretty clearly some reasons why that didn't quite go quite as well as people hope. One of them has to do with the fact that models like that just have a huge number of parameters.
Right.
So you have to know all kinds of things. You have to know not only what the infection fatality rate of the virus is. You have to know what. After all, you may remember that early in 2020 they were particularly concerned about hospital beds being overtaxed. So you have to know what, for every age group, what's the probability of people going to the hospital. If they go to the hospital, what's the probability of them going into intensive care or whatever. They didn't have very good information about that. They got that from newspaper reports out of China, and then some very bootstrappy kinds of ways of figuring out what the underlying rate of infection was in China. So there were tons and tons of parameters, and not only those, but also like if people are in the home more hours per day, how much does the contact rate change?
Right.
If you get infected, how long are you how long does it take between the time when you're exposed to the virus and when you become contagious? How long between when you become contagious and when you realize that you're sick and then or might self-isolate? They didn't know any of these numbers. And they also didn't do a thing that typically one does with policy guiding models, and that is when you have a lot of parameter values that you don't know the correct value of, it's kind of standard practice to sort of explore that parameter space and do what in climate science is called a perturbed physics ensemble. But basically the idea is you have a lot of parameter values. You should look at, if you're uncertain about them, you should look at what happens if it's this number.
Right. You provide a range. You provide a range in each value.
So give a range. And they didn't. So the original groups, they didn't do that. They kind of. I think sort of implicitly justified that. If you look at like the report 9, which was the report that the people who used the ICL model made, in there, they say something like, every day that you wait to lock down causes X more people to die. So that was, I think, maybe the implicit argument. We don't have time to do these, to do this kind of stuff. People did eventually do it. They did eventually do, perturbation studies on these. They found, that they were very sensitive to certain key parameter values that made a big difference, that for some parameter values, the interventions didn't do any good. They also found that the models were kind of not structurally suitable. In other words, there weren't really any values of parameters that did a good job of getting back what we were seeing in some parts of the world. And I think one of the obvious things that was missing from the models, and we don't know really what it was, but there did seem to be something that caused the epidemic to come in waves, even in the absence of interventions. And that's really not a feature that a lot of the early models had. All the early models had the basic underlying feature that if the government takes its hands off the pedal, you get what's called logistic growth, which is basically exponential growth until there's not enough people left, and only then does it decline. But we know now, right, from places like Sweden, Florida, places where the government eventually originally was or eventually became hands-off, the epidemic still came in waves, and people are still arguing about why that is. Is it because of behavioral changes? Is it because the virus was seasonal? Is it because something about the way the networks of people are kind of nonlinear and complicated? Can that somehow magically produce waves? We still don't really know why epidemics come with, but we kind of always, I mean, epidemiologists have told me, we were all taught in graduate school, like epidemics that, they come in waves, they last 3 years, in your lifetime. Those were the three things everybody's told me. This is what we were taught in epidemiology school. Epidemics last 3 years, they come in waves, you will have a big one in your lifetime. But we kind of forgot that they come in, we kind of forgot this one important lesson, which is that they do tend to come in waves anyway. And so a lot of the warnings that, like, in the absence of interventions, we would just get this blow up, logistic growth like that. Pretty clearly didn't happen in Sweden, didn't happen in Florida, didn't happen in developing countries where they didn't have the resources to lock down, et cetera. So
those are great points. I mean, that Sunetra Gupta's perspective is exactly that, right? That it's a seasonal virus, it comes in waves, and that most countries' waves can be explained by time of introduction, seasonality, and then the herd immunity threshold. And
I'm on team seasonality. I think it's controversial. I don't have a great argument. It's just my intuition.
And
so there is some biology work out there that suggests that it's actually the host that has the seasonality. So in other words, when there are rapid changes in the environment, it kind of weakens our immune system for a certain window. And when everybody in the same vicinity has their immunity weakened by a kind of change in the environment, that kind of opens this, I don't know, for COVID, it seemed like it was about 45 to 60 days of, boom, everybody gets hit at once. And then people's immunities kind of recover, and, the virus dipped off, but then it came back again for about the 3 years that everybody said epidemics last for.
Interesting. So, I mean, okay, going back to the point about, parameters, having these wide intervals of uncertainty, and sort of the tradition in climate science of actually, messing with the parameters and then seeing the variation that you have, and that not taking place in the infectious disease epidemiological research world.
Right.
Have you seen some of that? Have you seen any reform towards that?
It's complicated. I should be clear. There were sort of by I think the first paper I know of came out in June 2020. And then in September of 2020, there was a really good paper by a group led by an epidemiologist named Edling that did a really nice, perturbed ensemble on the ICL model, and started, revealing some of these weaknesses in it. First of all, revealing the degree to which it was highly sensitive to the parameters, and also showing respects in which it was sort of, people talk about there being both parameter uncertainty in models and structural uncertainty. So the parameter uncertainty comes from not knowing what the correct values are, but structural uncertainty is kind of deeper. It's like maybe the model just doesn't even have correct parameter values because it's just lacking certain structural features. Which again, if you think epidemics naturally come in waves, then pretty clearly the ICL model was missing a fundamental structural feature, because it's not capable of eliciting that behavior in the absence of external, and in the absence of changes in policy.
Right.
So it did seem like it was structurally flawed in that way. So there was like work like that being done. Like there were lots of good, responsible scientists doing that.
But do you think
those really come center stage?
Yeah, that's my question more, is like the mainstream sort of modeling groups, let's say in the UK, or I'm most familiar with the modeling groups in the UK. Do you feel like there has been an acknowledgement of these limitations and sort of an effort to reform and to...
there are a lot of papers. I mean, there are a lot of papers talking about how best practices weren't followed. There were a lot of papers talking about how self-evaluation was poor. I mean, there was this paper I don't know if you remember this paper from June of 2020, which was the lead author of that is named Flaxman, but it's Neil Ferguson's group, where they showed that, their interventions had saved hundreds of thousands of lives in Europe or whatever.
Yeah.
And ironically, right, they showed that interventions had saved, I think, 30,000 lives in Sweden.
Right.
And a lot of people, when they saw that, kind of scratched their head and it really seemed like there was some funny business in that.
Yeah.
And, they kind of, what they did was they made the only thing that Sweden had, the only NPI that Sweden had was they closed events of more than 50 people.
Right.
And in the model, it turned out it sort of had a Bayesian updating on what the power of those interventions was. And somehow in Sweden, it ended up being 70 times more effective than in any other European country. But
Right.
that was like, people had to like look under the hood to figure that out.
Yeah.
So it didn't really seem like there was like, it did seem like pretty quickly there was like, there were people, there were lots of people trying to figure out what was going on, and there were other people who were trying to double down on the
Yeah.
power that they
But
were
yet,
bringing there.
I mean, to keep on this paper as an example, that one has been cited, I think, over 1,000 or 2,000 times, and I'm sure that it's still being found in reports justifying the use of NPIs.
Yeah, that's probably right. That's pretty scandalous. It's a pretty scandalously bad paper. Yeah.
Was it in Nature proper, or
it was in Nature proper?
I think it's Nature proper,
yeah.
right?
I think that's right.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the issues with these modeling papers. They get into the top science journals. They have this sort of storyline around government intervention, and then it's just a snowball effect. It continues going, percolating into the literature in this way, right?
We know from the COVID origins stuff, we know that there were some pretty like heavy pressure being put on major journal editors. Like, so we know that like the original proximal origins paper that was in Nature Medicine, we know from like, leaked and FOIA emails or whatever that, Anthony Fauci was putting pressure on the editor to accept papers like that. I don't know of any evidence like that with the Flaxman paper, but pretty clearly like the system of peer review for the top journals was not what it should have been for a couple of years there, at least.
I mean, it's even broader than that. Just getting back to your point about season or waves, right?
Yeah.
And so very basics and the concept of herd immunity, which we've talked a lot about on this podcast previously or on the CG website, that the sort of misunderstanding or reinterpretation of herd immunity as a core concept, right? And so there seems to have just been, in the moment of panic, this sort of loss of very basic foundational components of infectious respiratory disease epidemiology.
Some of it you can even find people like Fauci repeating in January and February of 2020. Some of the wisdom, like there was a I think in 2006 or 2007, George W. Bush, he happened to read a book on the Spanish flu, and so he convened all this pandemic preparedness stuff. And there was a lot of accepted wisdom that came out of that, particularly about like NPIs that they were not effective, that masks were not effective. The ACLU had a very strong statement that they issued in 2008 as a result of some of that, saying that the use of law enforcement as a kind of public health intervention has a horrible history, and that it's an abominable thing to do. So and then in January and February, some of those lessons were repeated by fairly prominent people. Anthony Fauci said things like, masks don't work. You touch your face all the time. Closing schools is usually a bad idea. The costs are higher than the benefits. He said things like this. And then for some reason, whatever it was in March, we pivoted and people stopped repeating the conventional wisdom, and they started just adopting this new science that somehow just became accepted and started getting put in very, as you say, very prominent places like Nature.
Yeah. So here's a question for you, and this is something I've been quite concerned about and written about quite publicly about what I call the erosion of integrity in science itself. So, we have a redefinition of, let's say, the effectiveness of NPIs. So like you're saying, you go back in time and the same scientists who are promoting NPIs were saying, no, these are not generally effective. Do you think, or do you worry about an erosion of the standards of modeling going forward, or at least the coupling of modeling? I mean, your book is called Models in Science and Decision Making. Yeah. So the coupling of models in science with decision making.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, listen, I worry about it a lot. It's what I spend most of my time worrying about because, I come from a kind of a place of optimism about, originally in my career, a place of optimism about modeling, as I'm kind of known for being one of the people in philosophy of science was like, hey, we need to pay more attention to particularly computer simulation modeling. This is a very, active part of science. It's an extremely effective technique in engineering. I hope that it's effective for some things in climate science. I think it's sometimes people use it a little bit over optimistically, but I do think it's a useful tool in climate science for certain tasks. But it's an incredibly rhetorically powerful tool because it produces very compelling images and very compelling narratives. We all remember these pictures from early 2020 that came out of like the Neil Ferguson ICL group, right? Of like the curves blowing through, the red line was the maximum number of ICU beds in the UK, and then you set the knobs on different positions, and for some of them the line just goes blowing through it exponentially. That's very it's very rhetorically powerful,
right.
And it's also, when you have a lot of parameter values and you have a lot of knobs you can turn on a model, I think it's hard to even. You'd have to be a psychoanalyst of a kind that I'm not to really know like what was going on. Did they, did they have an agenda that they were pursuing and therefore like setting the knobs to get that agenda? Were they, erring on the side of caution in some sense in their minds by picking parameter values that were more alarming, or did they just happen to stumble onto ones that were alarming? So it's impossible to know, right? But all of those things are possibilities with models, and you have to kind of be alert to that. I think as we as consumers of both policymakers and those of us who elect policymakers who are consumers of the information provided as well. So we have to be, I think, aware that they can be really rhetorically powerful in that way.
That's a great point. And I like your metaphor of levers, because that's one of the things of the magic of models. They create this illusion of control that policymakers can just sort of pull these levers and control the spread of a virus in society.
They do have the levers, right? The policymakers have the levers.
Exactly.
They can close the schools. They can make us stay at home. They have their hands on those levers.
Exactly.
The illusion is not that they have the levers. The illusion is that we know what the levers are going to do.
Right.
That's what the models provide the illusion of, right? If it was just that they provided the illusion of a lever, that would be a little bit less alarming. It's that the levers are there, right? We have all these. I mean, policymakers have a lot of power.
Yeah.
And the most dangerous illusion is that we can very accurately forecast what those levers are going to do, when in fact we're in a situation where we have an enormous amount of uncertainty.
So you said you're an optimist on models, but that optimism has changed. You become more skeptical. But in the book, you talk about public participation in models. So maybe there's more optimism in terms of the role of the public actually to hold modelers or policymakers accountable for the mistakes that the levers create, let's say.
So here's the example I like to use to explain this point, and it goes back to the ICL model. It goes back to these parameter values about the infection fatality rate of the virus and the rate that it would cause hospitalization and ICU bed need, right? So again, we're going back to about early March, and Ferguson and the group, they want to make this model. They need to know those numbers, and they have two sources of information that they could use to get those. There's I don't know if you remember the Diamond Princess cruise ship.
Yeah.
So the Diamond Princess cruise ship, everybody on that ship was exposed. Everybody was tested. So we knew exactly who was infected, and we knew exactly who became hospitalized, and we knew exactly who died. The downside was that the crew was very bimodal in age. So there were crew that were in their 20s and 30s, and there were passengers that were mostly 70s and 80s. So we didn't really have a lot of data for people in the middle, like my age or your age. And then we had the Hubei data. And the Hubei data, we had some newspaper reports that gave us a pretty good idea of how many people had been admitted to the hospital. We didn't really know how many had gone to ICU, that they were doing a lot of guesswork on. We knew how many people had died, but we had no idea how many people were infected.
Okay.
And so what they did to estimate how many people were infected was there were these 6 airplanes full of people that were repatriated out of Hubei. I don't know if you remember this. Back in February of 2020, I think it
Right.
was France and the United States evacuated their expatriates out of Hubei province on 6 airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
They tested everybody on those airplanes. 6 people on those 6 airplanes tested positive.
Mm.
After people had been screened, if you had a fever, you weren't even allowed on the plane in the first place.
Mm.
So they tested 6 people tested positive, and then they said, "Oh, okay, 6 divided by however many people fill 6 planes. That's the rate of infection in Hubei province."
Okay.
So they had these two different data sets they could have used to estimate the infection fatality rate, the hospitalization rate for different decades.
Yeah.
Both of those produced, I think, quite different. If they had used the Diamond Princess, their forecasts would have been considerably less alarming.
Right.
My idea is when you're faced with like what I call a pivotal methodological choice like that in a model,
Yeah.
where what pretty clearly is going to dictate which one you'll use is going to be something like what do you think is what kind of error do you think is worse? Do you think it's worse to not scare people enough? Or
Right.
do you think it's worse to scare people too much?
Right.
Okay. My view is someone like Neil Ferguson is not well positioned to make that decision because he's a particular sort of person.
Mm-hmm.
He's a particular sort of person who is not necessarily hurt by lockdowns in the same way that other kinds of people are. He's also he's got, elderly relatives that he cares more about than other people do, et cetera. So people are going to have different assessments, right? About which is worse. Is it worse to scare people too much, or is it worse to scare people too little? And that's not a scientific judgment. That's a moral judgment. And it's a moral judgment that's informed by my values.
Yeah.
And it's informed by the kind of values that depend on what kind of person I am. That often people who are, as Jay Bhattacharya says, in the laptop class, right, typically have certain narrow sets of values. So my thought is, when you're doing modeling like that and you're making sort of important pivotal methodological choices in your model making, and you're making choices that I think ultimately have to reflect your balance of risks of that kind, you ought to be doing something like, what they have in Europe with mini publics, where you kind of have a lottery and you bring people in and you say like, hey, like we could use this Diamond Princess data, or we could do this thing where we've got like 6 people that tested positive on these 6 planes and they're all expats. They're not native, they're not really native inhabitants in the population that we're interested in. Which one do you think is better? And here you can kind of see we'll kind of guide you through what are the balance of risks involved in using either of these. That's the idea of public participation, to kind of get some of that intrinsically value ladenness of making these modeling choices into the hands of the public and out of the hands of people who are, who might have sort of a narrow set of values, being in the laptop classes or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, Eric, that's a great last point, I think, to end on. So thanks so much for the interesting conversation. And so everyone, that was Eric Winsberg. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of South Florida, and he's currently a British Academy Global Professor, the Department of History and Philosophy at the University of Cambridge. Thanks, Eric.
All right, thanks for having me on.